On the 29th of May, 1453, a gate opened from the inside. Not broken, not blasted, opened. By someone who was supposed to guard it. In the space of a single hour, 11 centuries of empire ended. Not because the walls failed, but because a man unlocked them. More than 50,000 soldiers had been hammering at those walls for 53 days. The mightiest cannon ever built had shaken the ground for weeks. And still, the walls held. Still. Until that gate swung open and Ottoman soldiers poured through like a tide that had finally found a crack in the rock. Think about what was lost in that moment. Not just a city, the last living memory of Rome, the final heartbeat of a civilization that had shaped the world for over 1,000 years. Snuffed out not by superior engineering, not by unstoppable military might, but by betrayal. Most people think the fall of Constantinople was inevitable. They picture a crumbling empire crushed under the weight of a modern army. They are wrong. The walls of Constantinople were, at the moment of their fall, still among the most sophisticated defensive structures on Earth. They had repelled over 20 major sieges across 1,000 years. What brought them down was not a cannon, it was a key. This is the story no tour guide tells you. This is the truth behind the walls. To understand the betrayal, you have to understand what was built. And to understand what was built, you have to go back over 1,000 years before that gate swung open, to a moment of absolute terror. The year 408. A Roman emperor, 16 years old, watching his world collapse from every direction at once. His name was Theodosius II. His empire was fracturing at every seam. The Visigoths had already sacked Rome just 2 years earlier. Barbarian armies were tearing through the western provinces like wildfire through dry grass. Trade routes were collapsing. Entire Roman cities were being abandoned. And Constantinople, the great eastern capital, the city Constantine I had built to be the new heart of Rome, had only one line of walls protecting it. One line, against a world on fire. Theodosius understood something that very few rulers of any era have truly grasped. A city is not just a place, it is an idea. And if that idea dies, everything built on top of it dies with it. He did not want better walls. He wanted a system, a machine of stone and mortar and mathematics designed not just to stop an army, but to destroy its will before it ever reached the first gate. The man he trusted with this task was his Praetorian prefect, a figure history barely remembers, a man named Anthemius. Most people have never heard that name. They should have. What Anthemius designed would take a decade to build, consume the labor of tens of thousands of workers, and outlast every military innovation of the next 1,000 years. It would be tested by Attila the Hun, by Arab fleets, by Viking raiders, by Mongol-descended armies, and it would not break. Not until that morning. Not until the gate. From the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn, nearly 4 miles, Anthemius laid out a triple defensive system unlike anything the ancient world had ever attempted. This was not simply a larger wall. It was an entirely different philosophy of defense. Every layer existed not to stop an army alone, but to weaken it, slow it, and deliver it broken and exhausted into the next killing zone. The first obstacle was not a wall at all. It was a moat. Nearly 60 feet wide and 22 feet deep, running the full length of the landward approach. In wet seasons, engineers diverted water from nearby streams to fill it completely. In dry seasons, its sheer depth made it a chasm that no army could cross quickly. Any force attempting to bridge or fill it would do so under continuous arrow fire from the walls above, with no cover and nowhere to retreat. Those who survived the crossing would reach the outer wall, 20 feet high, thick, studded with towers at regular intervals, lined with archers at multiple heights. But the outer wall was not meant to stop an army by itself. It was meant to slow it, bleed it, exhaust it, and funnel it into the most dangerous place on the entire battlefield. Because between the outer wall and the great inner wall lay a corridor, a killing ground 60 feet wide. Any soldier who made it over the outer wall dropped into this space completely exposed. The inner wall rising 40 feet before him, the outer wall standing at his back, archers firing from both directions at once. There was nowhere to advance quickly. there was nowhere to retreat. The corridor was a slaughterhouse by design. It was not a flaw in the system. It was the point of the system. The inner wall itself stood over 40 feet high, 15 feet thick at its base, punctuated by 96 towers climbing another 20 feet above the battlements. Each tower held supplies, weapons, oil, and command positions. Each tower had direct line of sight to the towers on either side, allowing defenders to signal threats across the entire 4-mile length in seconds. The speed of communication inside those walls was faster than any attacking army could move along the outside. The whole system obeyed one single principle. Every attacker must be under fire from the moment they approach the moat until the moment they either breach the inner wall or retreat. There was no safe ground. There was no blind angle. There was no gap anywhere in the approach. It took 10 years to complete. When it was finished, Theodosius looked out at what Anthemius had built and understood he had not merely constructed a wall. He had constructed permanence itself. He was right. The first great test came less than 30 years later. Attila the Hun, the man Roman historians called the Scourge of God, the conqueror who had burned his way through the Balkans, annihilating Roman armies in open field, reducing 70 cities to ash, arrived outside Constantinople. He looked at those walls, he made his calculation. He turned his army around and left. He never attacked the walls directly, not once. Historians have argued for centuries about why. Some say a diplomatic payment convinced him to withdraw. Some say it was logistics. Feeding an army of that size outside a heavily defended city for any extended period was nearly impossible in the 5th century. But the most honest answer is simpler. Attila understood mathematics. He looked at the moat, the outer wall, the corridor, the inner wall, and the 96 towers, and he understood what crossing all of that would cost him. He decided the price was too high. That calculation, that same moment of looking and turning away, would repeat across 1,000 years. The Arabs came twice. The first siege lasted 5 years, from 674 to 678. 5 years of sustained assault by a civilization that had just exploded out of Arabia and consumed the Persian Empire, Egypt, Syria, and North Africa in a single generation. The finest admirals and generals of early Islam stood outside those walls. They failed. The second Arab siege in 717 and 718 was even larger. Over 100,000 soldiers, nearly 2,000 ships. The walls held for 12 straight months. The besieging army was eventually broken by Greek fire launched from Byzantine ships, Bulgarian attacks on their rear supply lines, and the brutal Constantinople winter that no Arab commander had prepared his men to survive. The Bulgars came multiple times over the following centuries. So did the Rus, the Viking-descended warriors who had built their own empire along the river routes from the Baltic to the Black Sea. They arrived in 860 with a fleet of hundreds of ships, burning the suburbs outside the walls before the fortifications stopped them. The Vikings themselves raided at the gates more than once. 23 major sieges across 1,000 years. Every single one repelled. The city became something beyond a physical place. It became a symbol. The belief spread across the medieval world that Constantinople could not be taken, that God himself stood garrison behind those stones. Emperors in Constantinople were called the rulers of the world. Ambassadors from distant kingdoms arrived and wept at the sight of the city. For nearly 1,000 years, it was the largest, wealthiest, most sophisticated city in the Christian world. And then came the wound that God could not heal. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade arrived outside Constantinople. Christian knights from Western Europe, sworn to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule. They never reached Jerusalem. Led by Venetian merchants who held old commercial grievances against the Byzantine Empire and saw an opportunity for profit on a staggering scale, the Crusaders turned their weapons on the greatest Christian city in the world. The walls held on the first assault. They always held. But the Crusaders found a water gate that had been left inadequately guarded. A handful of soldiers slipped through. Fires were set inside the city. Panic spread through the streets. Constantinople fell to Christians in 1204. Not to any of the enemies it had repelled for 8 centuries, to its own supposed brothers in faith. The Crusaders stripped the city bare. They melted down bronze statues that had stood since the Roman Republic. They tore jewels from altars and reliquary boxes. They burned libraries. They smashed ancient marble. A Venetian doge, blind, over 90 years old, reportedly rode a horse through the looted streets on the day of the sacking, laughing. The accumulated treasures of 8 centuries of civilization vanished in days. The Latin Empire they installed lasted barely 60 years. The Byzantines reclaimed their capital in 1261, but the city they returned to was a shadow. The population had collapsed from hundreds of thousands to perhaps 50,000. The treasury was empty. The great trade networks that had made Constantinople the wealthiest city in the world were now controlled by Venetian and Genoese merchants who paid the Byzantines a fraction of what that commerce had once been worth. The military was hollowed out. Infrastructure was damaged and in many neighborhoods simply abandoned. For the next 2 centuries, the Byzantine Empire shrank province by province. The Ottomans, growing stronger every decade since the mid-1300s, absorbed everything around Constantinople until the city stood as an island, surrounded on all sides by Ottoman territory, connected to the outside world only by sea, living on borrowed time and the fading memory of what it had once been. The Ottomans were watching, and one of them was planning. Mehmed II came to the Ottoman throne in 1451 at the age of 19. He spoke 6 languages. He had read Greek and Roman history since childhood. He had studied every account of every failed siege of Constantinople, with the attention of a scholar and the hunger of a conqueror. He understood the walls better than most Byzantine commanders of his era, and he understood something no previous attacker had fully grasped. The walls could not be broken by ladders, not by mining, not by starvation, but they could be broken by something new, something that had never existed before in sufficient scale. Artillery, gunpowder weapons powerful enough to crack stone walls 40 feet thick. He found a Hungarian engineer named Urban who had first offered his services to Emperor Constantine XI. Constantine could not pay him. The treasury was empty. 2 centuries of economic decay since 1204 had left the empire financially gutted. Urban crossed the Bosphorus and presented himself to Mehmed. Mehmed paid him 4 times what he had originally asked and gave him everything he needed. Urban built the Basilica Cannon, the largest bombard the world had ever seen, or would see for another century. Over 26 feet long, its barrel so massive a man could crawl inside it. It fired granite balls specially quarried and cut to precise dimensions, each one weighing over 1,500 pounds. Casting the barrel took 3 months and required a specially constructed foundry outside Adrianople. Moving it to Constantinople required 60 oxen, a road crew of hundreds preparing the ground in advance, and 2 full months of travel. Mehmed also constructed a fleet to blockade the city from the sea. He built a new fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus in just 4 months, cutting off Byzantine supply lines from the Black Sea. He assembled soldiers from across his empire, janissaries, Anatolian infantry, cavalry, engineers, sappers, artillery crews. When his army appeared before the walls of Constantinople in early April of 1453, estimates of its size ranged from 60,000 to over 100,000 men. The Byzantine defenders numbered fewer than 7,000. 7,000 men to hold 13 miles of fortifications against that. Constantine XI had spent years sending desperate letters to every Christian ruler in Europe, to the Pope, to Venice, to Genoa, to the kings of France, Hungary, and Aragon. His argument was not sentimental, it was strategic. If Constantinople falls, the Ottomans gain a permanent foothold in Europe. The ancient overland trade routes to Asia close forever. The scholars and libraries of the classical world, everything preserved and transmitted through centuries of Byzantine civilization, the texts of Plato and Aristotle, the medical writings of Galen, the architecture of Justinian, will be scattered or destroyed. Most of Europe did not come. One man came. A Genoese nobleman named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo arrived in January of 1453 with 700 professional soldiers, his own ships, and his own personal resources, committed entirely to the defense. He was not a mercenary. He was a man who understood what was at stake and refused to look away. Constantine gave him command of the Mesoteikion, the most vulnerable section of the land walls. where the fortifications dipped into the valley of the Lycus River at their lowest point. This was the exact section Mehmed had identified as the primary target for the basilica cannon. For 53 days, Giustiniani held it. The cannon fired 7 times a day. Each shot created a shockwave felt for miles. The stone balls struck the outer wall with a force nothing in the medieval world had ever generated. Sections of the outer wall crumbled, towers cracked. Entire stretches of the fortification were reduced to rubble by nightfall. And every night, every single night for 53 days, Giustiniani organized his soldiers and the surviving civilian population into repair crews who worked by torchlight. Men and women carried stones. Priests worked alongside soldiers. Children hauled water and timber. Earth was packed into the breaches. Wooden palisades were raised in the gaps. By dawn, the wall was standing again. Every morning, the wall was still there. Mehmed tried tunneling beneath the foundations. Byzantine engineers detected the vibrations underground, located every Ottoman tunnel, and countermined, collapsing them before they reached the wall. He dragged his fleet overland around the chain, blocking the Golden Horn in a remarkable feat of logistics, placing his ships inside the harbor. The harbor walls held every assault. He launched simultaneous attacks on multiple sections of the land walls at once, trying to stretch the 7,000 defenders past their breaking point. Every assault was repelled. 50 days. The most powerful military force the Ottomans had ever assembled had not broken the walls. And inside the city, something extraordinary had happened. 7,000 exhausted defenders had held off an army that outnumbered them by a ratio of 10 to 1, repaired their walls every night under cannon fire, and refused to break. The walls of Anthemius, built 1,000 years before, were still doing exactly what they had been designed to do. And then Giustiniani was hit. A projectile. The sources cannot agree whether it was an arrow, a crossbow bolt, or an early firearm ball, struck him during one of the major assaults on the Mesetikion. The wound was serious enough that he asked Constantine for permission to leave the wall and be carried to his ship for treatment. Constantine begged him to stay. He understood what this departure would mean. Not just the loss of one commander, but the psychological collapse it would trigger in every soldier watching from along the walls. Giustiniani left the wall. Within minutes, his men saw the stretcher being carried away. The soldiers who had repaired the wall every night for 50 days, who had held their nerve under cannon fire and assault after assault, who had done what no one in Europe had believed 700 men could do. Those men looked at the empty space where their commander had stood. They looked at the Ottoman army still stretching to the horizon, and something that had been held taut for 53 days finally snapped. They began to fall back. It was in this precise window, this gap of minutes between Giustiniani's departure and any reorganization of the defense, that a small group of Ottoman soldiers, probing along the northern section of the wall, reached the Kirkaporta gate and found it standing open. The Kirkaporta was a small postern gate, barely wide enough for 2 men to walk abreast, set into the wall near the Blachernae Palace. It existed for a specific tactical purpose. Byzantine cavalry would sortie through it to strike the flanks of Ottoman formations, then return and bar it from the inside, before any enemy could follow. On the morning of May 29th, someone had not barred it. Whether this was accident, exhaustion, or deliberate sabotage is the question historians have argued for 5.5 centuries. No name has ever been established, no motive ever proven. The truth of the Kirkaporta has been swallowed by history, along with everything else that died that morning. No more than 50 Ottoman soldiers found the gate open in the pre-dawn darkness. They did not force it. They did not batter it. They walked through. They climbed the wall above the gate and raised the Ottoman banner over the battlements. Defenders across the city saw the banner flying above them. The psychological effect was immediate and total. Men who had beaten back every assault for 53 days suddenly believed the walls had been taken everywhere. Panic moved through the defense like fire through dry wood. Soldiers abandoned their posts. The communication network that Anthemius had built into the system 1,000 years before, the network that had held every previous siege together, collapsed in minutes. By the time Constantine XI understood what was happening, it was already over. He made a choice that history records as one of the most extraordinary final acts any ruler has ever made. He removed his imperial regalia. He stripped off the purple robes and the jeweled crown, every symbol of his dynasty and his office, every mark of the empire that had existed since Augustus. He picked up a sword, and he charged into the mass of Ottoman soldiers pouring through the breach near the Kirkeporta. His body was never found. Some accounts say he was killed almost immediately, just another soldier swallowed by the chaos of the breach. Others say he fought for several minutes before being overwhelmed. Ottoman soldiers searching the dead afterward reportedly found a body bearing the imperial eagle embroidered on its boot, the only mark that remained to identify the last emperor of Rome. A legend spread through the Greek world in the years and decades after the fall. An angel had descended at the last moment and turned Constantine to marble, sealing him in a hidden chamber beneath the city's golden gate. That one day, when Constantinople needed him most, the marble would break and the Marble King would return to take back his throne. The Greeks whispered this for centuries. Mehmed II entered the city later that morning and rode through streets that had been among the most crowded in the world. He found them silent. Thousands of civilians had taken refuge inside the Hagia Sophia, believing the ancient promise that heaven itself would intervene before the great church could fall to unbelievers. Ottoman soldiers broke down the doors. The people inside were taken prisoner. The looting of the city began. Mehmed rode to the Hagia Sophia himself. At the entrance, he dismounted, bent down and picked up a handful of earth. He poured it slowly over his head, a gesture of humility before God, an acknowledgement that all conquest belongs to heaven and not to the ambitions of men. Then he walked inside. He stood beneath the dome, 182 feet above him, the largest enclosed interior space in the world. Light pouring through 40 windows set at the base of the dome, filling the vast interior with a quality of golden illumination that architects would spend centuries trying to understand and replicate. The great mosaics of Christ and the Virgin and the saints caught that light and sent it back in every direction. 900 years of accumulated beauty, the most magnificent space human beings had ever constructed. Mehmed stood beneath it and wept, or so the chroniclers recorded. Whether those were tears of awe at the magnitude of what he had won, or something closer to grief at what he had destroyed, or simply the overwhelming weight of standing inside a moment of historical finality that he himself had created. No source records his explanation. Mehmed was not a man who explained himself. The Hagia Sophia became a mosque before the day was over. The bells were taken down and silenced. The Christian mosaics were covered with whitewash. The call to prayer replaced the liturgy that had echoed under that dome for 9 centuries. Constantinople became Istanbul, and Rome, the idea of Rome, the civilization of Rome, the unbroken thread stretching from Augustus to Constantine XI across 14 centuries, simply ended. Not with a treaty, not with a negotiation. With a man charging into an army alone, with nothing but a sword and 1,000 years of pride. But here is the thing that changes how you see the entire story. The fact every serious historian of this period eventually confronts: the walls worked. 53 days of the most powerful artillery in the world, the largest Ottoman army ever assembled, one of the most gifted military commanders of the 15th century directing the assault. And the walls had not been militarily overcome. Every breach had been repaired before dawn. Every assault had been repelled. The basilica cannon had cracked towers and crumbled sections of the outer wall, and the defenders had filled every gap with earth and timber every single night. The walls did not fall. They were unlocked from the inside and abandoned in panic. The Ottoman army after 53 days was running critically low on supplies. Its morale had been severely damaged by the repeated repulses. Several of Mehmed's own senior commanders had already counseled withdrawal. The scholarly consensus today is that Mehmed had at most a few more days of real offensive capability before logistics would have forced him to retreat and abandon the siege. A few more hours. That was all the walls needed. Instead, a gate was left open. If you walk along the Theodosian Walls today, and you can, sections still stand for miles through modern Istanbul, you can find the Kirkeporta. It is still there, small, unremarkable. set into the ancient stone as if nothing of consequence happened there. Tourists walk past it every day, photographing more dramatic stretches of the fortification. They do not know what they are looking at. They do not know that the gate in front of them is the place where Rome ended. The question that cannot be answered and cannot be forgotten is this: if Justiniani had not been wounded, if he had stayed on that wall for one more hour, if the Kirkaporta had been barred when it should have been barred, would the Ottoman army have broken? Would Mehmed have been forced to retreat? Would Constantinople have survived? And with it, what might have remained of the ancient world? We cannot know. History does not run twice. What we know is that the most sophisticated defensive system ever built held for 1,000 years against everything humanity could throw at it. And it fell in a single morning, not because it failed, because a gate was left open, because a man was carried from his post, because a civilization had finally run out of the one thing no wall can ever provide: the will to hold. Some walls are made of stone, some walls are made of will. And the night the will cracked, even before the gate swung open, even before Justiniani left his post, even before Constantine stripped the purple from his shoulders, the empire was already lost. Not from the cannon fire outside, from 200 years of abandonment that had hollowed it out from within, from the Crusaders who sacked it in 1204, from the Allies who promised ships and sent almost nothing, from the treasury with no gold left to pay for soldiers or for hope. The Theodosian Walls were strong enough to protect an empire. They were not strong enough to replace one. The last Roman emperor charged into an Ottoman army with a sword and was swallowed by history. The walls he died defending are still standing. His body was never found. The gate that ended his empire is still there, set into those ancient stones, exactly where it was on the morning everything ended. Walk past it sometime, if you ever find yourself in Istanbul. Put your hand on the limestone, feel the weight of what was built there, and what was lost there, and what is still standing there against all reason and all time, and ask yourself the question that has no answer. If the gate had been locked, where would we be now?